Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Yousaf Nishat Botero in today's episode. Yousaf is assistant professor at the University of Birmingham, working at the intersection of critical theory, organization theory, and political theory. Yousaf's work is of great interest to me in general, I have to say, but today we are mainly going to talk about two fantastic papers he wrote. The first one is titled Planning's Ecologies, Democratic Planning in the Age of Planetary Crisis, and the second paper is titled Planning in Nature's Metropolis, Metabolic Municipalism and Ecological Planning in Barcelona. This is a really nice combination, I think, because one paper takes us on the planetary scope and the other very much grounds its thinking in questions of proximity and local food sovereignty through radical municipalism as a medium of democratic planning. But before we delve into these topics and the conversation with Yousaf, I want to thank Fabian, Wilfried, Heimo, Karl, Valentin, Ralf, Christoph, Lukas, Alexander, and Maike for their kind donations. It's highly appreciated. Thank you so much. And just a brief note on Future Histories itself. This conversation with Yousaf marks the first episode of the fourth season of Future Histories and is thus the season opening. A big thank you to all of the listeners of this podcast. I am very much looking forward to this new season with many more exciting conversations ahead. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Yousaf Nishat Botero on Ecologies of Planning and Metabolic Municipalism. Welcome, Yousaf.
Thanks for the invitation and the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Yousaf. One of the reasons I enjoyed your paper on planning's ecology so much is that it expands the scope of how to think about democratic planning in a way that I find to be extremely relevant. You develop, and I quote you here, a critical political ecology of planning that situates planning, thought, and practice within the matrix of the oikos, end quote. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. Let's maybe start with the role of critical political ecology with regard to democratic planning, because usually there's talk of democratic economic planning, and it is commonly associated with the field of political economy. So I myself have speculated in a text that political ecology might replace political economy as a privileged field of knowledge when it comes to democratic planning. So I was very much interested in this shift towards critical political ecology in your text. What does it mean to situate planning within a critical political ecology?
Sure, yeah. So without getting into all the kind of distinct ways political ecology has been taken up in various fields, like anthropology, human geography, economics, and so on. I think a basic premise is that of political ecology is that kind of ecological issues cannot be understood without considering the material and symbolic kind of politics that shape the natural world. Right. So I think this is kind of a basic premise of kind of all the different ways political ecology has been kind of taken up and elaborated over kind of the years. And this gives us kind of a language to articulate how human and non-human natures, if you like, come together, as well as how this process of coming together is always already political, is always kind of a site for politics, right? For politicization, if you like. And the concept I've been working with and kind of thinking with, drawing kind of on the work of many guests of the podcast, actually, is the concept of social metabolism, right? So, as you know, this concept was introduced by Justus von Liebig. I don't know if I'm saying the name correctly, in the mid-19th century. And since then, kind of most notably via Marx, but others too, it has been used kind of to make sense of labor as a process kind of involving human beings and nature, right? So Marx's way of putting this, as he does in Capital, is that kind of humans work with materials found in nature right? And in making use of these materials to produce use values, right? To produce kind of the things that we need, human beings alter the natural world, right?
Mm.
So German speakers will know metabolism comes from Stoffwechsel, I think. Is that how you, not sure if that's how you say it, but
Stoffwechsel, yeah.
yeah, there you go. Thank you. And so this has obviously an element of, it captures this aspect of, transforming the natural world that we engage with in order to produce the things that we need. Um, so again, I have a quote here from Capital Volume 1 in front of me, if you allow me to read it. So Marx writes, and I quote here, we tend to see plants and animals as natural products, but they aren't, right? Rather, as they exist today, plants and animals are products that took shape by being continuously transformed over many generations, in a process controlled by human beings and mediated by their labor. And just before this, I think this is quite important. Um, Marx also writes that kind of this labor metabolic process is um, is mediated by infrastructures, right? The example he uses are canals and roads, but of course we can extend that to all the other kinds of infrastructures we can think of today, like uh, logistical systems and so on, which I think we'll probably come back to later in our discussion. So in short, much of the natural world that we assume to be kind of pre-social or non-social is a metabolized product kind of human organization, right? All modes of life depend on a kind of labor metabolic process of transforming the natural kind of world. And this can be organized in a kind of more or less, regenerative or destructive way, right? So having said all this, like, what do I mean by a critical political ecology of planning? I'm basically insisting that, economic planning is always already implicated in the organization of life itself, right? In the organization of what Jason Moore calls the web of life. And that means kind of taking seriously how economic practices, encompassing production and reproduction, are embedded in and depend on kind of these ecological processes of the biosphere. So again, these social metabolic relations are not neutral, right? And this means that economic planning cannot be treated in merely technical or managerial terms, right? It also means that in a context of climate crisis, we can no longer kind of simply think in terms of the opposition between use value and exchange value, right? As it's often done. And I think obviously that's very important and should remain central, of course. But also perhaps kind of this relationship between use value and what Ariel Salleh calls, metabolic value, right? The kind of
Mm.
value that's produced by the biosphere, by what some call, I think, a little bit awkwardly, but I go along with it. We might get into this, the labor of nature, right?
Right.
On the point, if I can just say one thing, you asked me about the question of political economy, right? Just a quick point. Yeah, on that note, I guess there's a lot more to say about there's a lot to say about the critique of political economy that I can't get into here. But one of those things is kind of the critique of the idea that there is such a thing as the economy, right? As
Mm.
this kind of distinct sphere that's governed by its own laws, right? Separate from what I've been trying to get at with this idea of the oikos, right? So I'm not quite sure if political ecology would replace something like political economy, but I do think it helps us kind of problematize and expose these separations, economy, nature, society, nature, production, reproduction, as kind of separations that are a result of capitalist social relations, as and not some kind of ontological fact, of social reality. So to that extent, I think political ecology might help us advance or reground the critique of political economy in maybe a different language. I'm not sure if it would necessarily replace it. Yeah, as
Mm.
such, I think that's an open question. Um,
Mm, indeed, very much open question. And I mean, you just mentioned the oikos, and this is very much an important framework for the way in which you try to situate the question of democratic planning within this broader framework and understand it as a form of democratically planning the oikonomia, if you want to frame it like that. Could you maybe get a little bit more into this question of the oikos and how this shift towards the perspective of the oikos, how this changes the way in which we think about democratic planning in general?
Mhm. Yeah, so as I think maybe many of your guests might know, both economy and ecology are words that share the same Greek root in the term oikos, right? Oikos means house or household, right? So it's a root so to refer to a kind of planetary oikos would be to talk about a planetary household, as I've proposed. And this is essentially kind of what I'm trying to gesture at is a need to think economic planning in this kind of integrated way, as encompassing not only commodity production and exchange, right? The sphere of let's say, value, right? But also the disavowed, gendered, and kind of racially stratified spheres of social and ecological reproduction, right? And I do this kind of drawing on critical feminist and eco-Marxist ideas, right? What does this mean? This means kind of taking a spatial and totalizing view onto capitalism as something more than just an economic system, right? Um, or kind of also not simply reducing it to like the category of the market.
Mm.
Um, so Nancy Fraser and Jason Moore, for instance, both each of them, see capitalism as a kind of socio-ecological totality, dependent on these disavowed non-capitalist spaces and practices, right? Or if extra economic spaces and practices. And this includes social reproduction, and it includes forms of ecological extractivism. Um, yeah, and so Nancy Fraser refers to this as capitalism's background conditions of possibility, right? And as you know, Christoph Sorg has an excellent paper on economic planning where he draws on Fraser's work in this way. Yeah. Um, So this attempt to see planning from the standpoint of the planetary oikos, as I'm kind of trying to suggest, I see actually as sharing quite a lot with Christoph's paper. I think if you read two papers, you see a lot of overlap, with the difference that I've drawn more on kind of the ecological kind of Marxist kind of vocabulary and concerns, right? So someone like Jason Moore would specify these background conditions differently, as kind of the economically and ontologically devalued natures, right, which include labor
Mm.
power, food, energy, raw materials, and so on. And what does this mean? Well, it means kind of expanding the scope of economic planning to rethink it from the standpoint of things like housing, childcare, healthcare, agriculture, nature, and so on and so forth. But also very importantly, kind of in a way that doesn't subordinate, what I'm calling the oikos, to forms of, non-market planning that might nevertheless kind of presume and reproduce, state productivist or kind of neo-colonial logics, right? This also means kind of experimenting with and moving towards multi-criterial or kind of value pluralist modes of organizing, that should kind of account for the plurality of values of the oikos, right? Just to kind of contrast that with kind of the value monism of something like market price, right? Or any other kind of single unit of measure. Of course, kind of since the publication of this article, since the writing of this article, which was a year or two before it, actually came out, there's been obviously a lot of good work in this direction, right? So, I think of Aaron Benanav, Cedric Duran, Elena Hopperbeth, and obviously members of the Planning for Entropy Collective, that have been, making some important contributions in what this might mean concretely, right? How might we
Mm.
account for and value the diversity of values, in a way that, any single unit of measure cannot, right? Uh, in a kind of more political institutional sense, what does this mean? I'm sympathetic to, and I've also written about this in the papers we're discussing today, this idea of like public common forms of organizing, and I think these are quite important elements for channeling these, more popular and plural forms of knowledge, which are central to planning. Um, yeah.
Before we get to this whole set of questions surrounding the practicability and how one might approach this in very concrete terms. I do have another question with regard to the concept of the oikos, because I'm kind of torn to a certain degree, because I do get the argument that this notion of the oikos actually expands the field which we try to include in our considerations. And you mentioned these background conditions, the framing of Nancy Fraser, also the web of life coming from Jason Moore, and so on. So I'm absolutely not only sympathetic, but I'm in favor of this enlarging of our perspective with regard to not only democratic planning, but also more broader questions of how to organize life collectively, let's say. But then also there's another note to this idea of the household. I mean, it's not really that much, because maybe oikos is not that common of a term, but if you take the word household, it also has an element of closing down. So if you talk about the planetary household, it suggests a kind of graspable, neat thing that you can imagine as one, let's say, as a household. And with regard to that, I had to think about like the late Bruno Latour, who described this critical zone, I remember, as a space in which terrestrial life can actually take place. And he argues that we should also stay within this critical zone and stuff like that. And this, when reading that, at least to me, had a very much a notion of closing down as well. And I was wondering if the notion of oikos, if read as a household, as a planetary household in this case, also might have this element of closing down to it. And if yes, what this would mean with regard to a broader push towards a form of, I don't know, openness as well.
Yeah. No, I see your concerns with kind of what this idea of the household brings to mind, right? In the case of Latour, I mean, my understanding of his idea of the critical zone, correct me if I'm wrong, is that kind of this is this thin layer within which kind of human life can flourish, right? That we need to kind of defend, repair, and so on and so forth. Yeah. I mean, to that extent, I'm sympathetic to that, to the extent that, well, this is this is the only home we have in that sense, right? All these fantasies about, colonizing Mars or whatever are fantasies. So to that extent, I can be sympathetic with this idea of the critical zone. What is unclear to me, maybe perhaps you can say a bit more, is what you might mean by openness in that regard.
I think it's easier to grasp, not so much with regard to the critical zone and whether or not one wants to go to Mars. I think it's easy to say, I would agree that we shouldn't bet on going to Mars as an escape plan from Earth and stuff like that. So I would totally agree to that, I guess. But I think if you think about the notion of the household as something that we commonly refer to as something where usually, like traditionally in the Greek sense, like the male patriarch is going to rule over, he's going to wisely decide how to manage the household. So there are a couple of associations coming with this notion of the household, which one is this idea of one whole, and this is what I mean with closing down, but also others, as I said, with male-coded patriarch running the household and stuff like that, vis-a-vis a notion of, let's say, for example, democratic planning as a discovery mechanism, which we will talk about later as well, because I'm also really interested in that, which is an open-ended notion of democratic planning, which frames the task differently than an idea of planning a planetary household, I would argue. And also, maybe as a last point, we know of these highly problematic notions of calculating an equilibrium within many traditions of neoclassical economic thought and so on, which also think of a closed space which one can and should calculate in order to find an optimal equilibrium. And this is, of course, something that the planning debate, historically speaking, did reproduce as well. If we think of Lange, Oscar Lange, and models like that. And there again, one might argue that, maybe it's not a good idea to assume this closed space that can be intelligible, that can be calculable, that can be graspable as one thing, the household. So that would be my short monologue on the household. Sorry.
So I think one way to deal with this question is first, I begin with this distinction between the oikos and the crematistics of the market, right? So crematistics, is this idea that it's an abstracted conception of economic activity where you could envisage something like infinite accumulation, right? And in contrast to that, the oikos is the space of kind of use value production. Right. So I agree, I think your discomfort perhaps with this idea of the household, given, how the history of the household and the history of patriarchy and so on. I think that's, correct. And, I'm sympathetic to that. And probably, it would be wise to take such a kind of suggestion to think in terms of the household with some suspicion or some wariness. So I take that on board. I think it's a fair point to make. But nevertheless, historically, I mean, etymologically, the oikos was understood as kind of the space of use value production, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons I kind of went with it, right? Also kind of trying to rethink that from the kind of feminist tradition, right? To say like, actually, the oikos is a part of the economy, right? It is related in one way or another, and there's many debates about this, to kind of value producing activity, right? But it's kind of disavowed and externalized and kind of domesticated, right? There are, attempts to think about it as outside of politics and outside, public life and so on. And so I think, engaging and learning from that tradition is also how I've been trying to kind of, propose this idea. And of course, from like a Marxian perspective, to think of the planetary oikos as a kind of open and, differentiated unity, right? So it's not this kind of static, ahistorical, how can I put it, contained space that, I'm trying to, how can I say, make the case for, if that's clear. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense. And I just wanted to add that I'm, even though I sound as if I'm arguing against the oikos, I'm actually not, because I'm very much in favor of using the framework. Also, I mean, Jason Moore
right.
translates it into what he then calls the web of life.
Yeah.
This also has a very different connotation to it and stuff like that. I think it was just the specific combination of planetary household that made me think about these questions.
Right.
But it sounds much more critical to the approach than it actually is, because I do find it to be very fruitful to bring in the oikos when it comes to thinking about democratic planning. It's I just wanted to make that clear. But I wanted to pick up on what you said in your answer right now, because I mean, of course, a central argument of what you're trying to point at is that one needs to bring in all of these different aspects that need to be considered but aren't considered in the way that, for example, this clean conceptualization of the economy does not. And you actually make the argument that democratic planning must account not only for the forces of production, but also for the forces of reproduction. And you cite Stefania Barca in order to outline what this would need to entail, namely democratic planning would need to account for, and I quote here, those agencies, racialized, feminized, waged and unwaged, human and non-human labors that keep the world alive. End quote. And as a claim, that is, of course, absolutely correct, and I would fully support it, but it quickly becomes extremely difficult when one thinks about how this could be done in practical terms. You already hinted towards some of the approaches that were also being discussed in future histories. So I would be interested in your take. What would this look like in practical terms? How could one incorporate, for example, non-human labor into the way we think about democratic planning, not only think about, but do democratic planning. So what could this look like in concrete terms?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, maybe to take that question from a slightly different angle first, I've been recently, been thinking more about kind of the idea and the history of socialization, right? My impression, being in the UK, my impression is there's a much richer debate in the German context as compared to the Anglophone context, right? But I like this term because I think it makes it possible to think about, what we might call kind of more than state forms of planning, more than
Mm,
state forms of economic planning, right?
right.
So yes, the state will be necessary, or state-like institutions will be necessary, at least in a kind of transitional phase, right? Um, and I think socialization is helpful, in that regard. Um, um, as a precondition, to even beginning to address kind of the question that you put to me, right? And this is partly what has kind of motivated my research on what I guess we'll talk about soon, this idea of kind of metabolic municipalism, as well as kind of more recent work I'm doing on kind of the land question and so on, right? So kind of to return to the term that Stefania Barca proposes, this idea of the like forces of reproduction, right?
Mm.
For her, the forces of reproduction are also what she calls kind of earth care labor, right? And this refers to kind of the activities and practices of caring for the biophysical conditions of social reproduction, right? So I think very consistent kind of with what I've been trying to kind of formulate in terms of the oikos, right? Social reproduction and kind of the conditions for the kind of reproduction of the web of life that we depend on as parts of the web of life, right? And in the context of economic planning, if we think about, what this might entail and the kind of, practices and activities, what this might entail in that regard, that could include things like, land sparing practices, right? Like conservation, as problematic as that history is. And it's very important to kind of really highlight that point, right? As well as kind of protecting agricultural zones in urban and peri-urban areas from kind of the further encroachment of urban sprawl and things like that. And organizing these spaces in more kind of agri form, aligned with principles of things like agroecological sovereignty, right? Food sovereignty. Um, and all these interventions, I think, are kind of infrastructural ways of thinking about, economic planning, right? So to kind of go back to the point I made in the beginning about, um, well, reading that quote from Capital, is that, for Marx, our relationship with nature is also kind of mediated by, various kinds of infrastructures, right? Um, So I'm not sure if I answer your question, but I think probably that would be my way of thinking about it, like less in terms, I'm not an economist, so I'm not thinking about things like indicators necessarily. Like
Mm.
it's not my area of expertise. But what are the political institutional conditions for being able to, create spaces for the articulation of these kind of oppositional identities, needs, and interests, right? Um, and also kind of what are the socio-material conditions needed for that? Yeah, I hope I sort of touched on that in what I just said. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do get it. I understand the examples as well when it comes to them creating spaces that are indeed able to include some of these elements. I think there are still some open questions with regard to, for example, the inclusion of non-human labor. There are, of course, within the left discussions about whether or not this even exists as a concept, non-human labor. There are people who argue that labor is exclusively something that humans do.
Yeah.
If one disagrees with that and uses in some way, shape, or form a concept of non-human labor, it of course becomes an interesting challenge, let's say, to think about how to include something like non-human labor into processes of democratic planning, for which a consideration of labor in general is, of course, a very, very important factor. And if you then argue that there is something like non-human labor indeed going on, then this creates a couple of quite huge question marks with regard to how to include non-human labor into democratic planning in concrete and practical terms. Also, very much with regard to the democratic aspect, not only with regard to forms of calculation, which we do approach through material and energy flow accounting and stuff like that, but also with regard to the democratic aspect of it, for example.
Yeah. I have some ideas about this, but I'm not sure like I can really put this in kind of in relation to planning as such. There are other initiatives that, planning would have to account for.
If you do have some thoughts coming from other fields, other, I don't know, traditions, theoretical traditions or whatever, then this would nonetheless be interesting. I mean, of course, there are things like Haraway's responsibility, stuff like that. But with these, equally, there are huge question marks when it comes to how to actually implement them in concrete, practical terms beyond the small and the local, stuff like that. But I just wanted to say that if you have any thoughts about this, not directly coming from the planning debate, this would nonetheless be super interesting, because then one might build bridges in some way, shape, or form, you know?
Yeah. So if I'm not sure, I'm not sure how much I could speak to it now. I'd have to do some thinking.
Right.
But the point, is that in for example, discussions around agroecology, for instance, there is kind of this basic idea that you are organizing what's going on in the production and the provisioning of food in a way that follows kind of the logics of nature itself, rather than kind of subsuming natural processes into, let's say, forms of, capital accumulation.
Permaculture, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, one way to approach this is, if you think of, the category of subsumption, right? So it's not only kind of the human labor process that is subsumed by capital, right? That takes on like a capitalist form, right? But in that process of subsuming labor, you also have kind of the subsumption of nature, right? And so when I think of kind of, to account for the labor of nature and kind of the logics of nature, it would be something different from something that counters this process of subsumption. So that kind of modes of organizing, rather than kind of relating to nature in this kind of extractivist way and reconfiguring them in a way that is ecologically destructive, but might nevertheless produce things that we need. Oh, sorry. It's really, I have some thoughts about this, but I can't put it in words yet. It's quite,
all right.
Yeah.
Don't worry. But I think you did a really good job right now. It worked out. Because it would have ended in, if we find ways of organizing the reproduction of the web of life in a way that does not reproduce the subsumption of nature, as it does not reproduce the subsumption of human work, human labor, then we would have gained a form of I don't know, a general approach towards these questions, which at least brings us forward, even though not maybe perfectly answering the question of how to include non-human labor as a democratic quote unquote voice. But maybe that's not necessary
Mm,
because it's not possible.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah, what I'm trying to maybe get at is like, uh, the biosphere kind of nature has kind of is governed by its own logics, right? Which don't
Hmm.
necessarily correspond directly with
Sure.
the kind of societies that we have, right?
Right. Hmm.
Even what we understand kind of as the history of kind of socialist kind of societies and socialist social forms, right? And so accounting for the labor of nature would be to respect what nature does already, which is
Hmm.
produce things
Hmm.
that we make use of, right?
Hmm.
Without kind of
Hmm.
suggesting that there is this kind of pristine social nature that is
Right.
uncorrupted and, you know, uh, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
keeping into account the fact that, we are fundamentally interwoven with nature and, the other way around. Yeah.
I could see you think. I like. I enjoy that.
Nice.
Okay. So another thing that I picked up on when reading your paper is this notion of planning's ecologies, because I'm really interested in the way in which we could maybe include a form of ecological thinking into the planning debate that maybe thinks of, for example, organizational ecologies
Mm,
in a way that we do not do right now, at least in the works that I know of coming from the current planning debate. So I really enjoyed this hint towards ecologies of planning. What is it that you're trying to bring across with this notion of ecologies of planning?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of ecologies brings to mind the idea of a kind of complex, plural, and interdependent kind of system, with many levels and scales and relationships, right? An ecology is planetary, right? And we can make sense of it at a planetary scale. But it's also kind of very uneven, right? If you go down to kind of these different kind of localities, right? And I think that's what I found appealing about this idea of, ecologies of planning, that, planning would also have to be mod or organized or that it's a helpful metaphor for thinking how we might organize planning, right? That, we don't, I think we're misguided to be on the lookout for the single right, way in which to organize planning everywhere, right? And so I think that gives a little bit of openness to, how we should approach this question of experimentation. But it also says something about, what societies are actually like, right? We can make sense of, societies at this kind of macro scale, but, things look quite different depending where you are within kind of the world, right? And it's important to kind of account for that. Um, I think this also connects kind of with a view of the economy that we find in someone like Fernand Braudel, right? So in Braudel, you have a kind of zonal understanding of coexisting economies. And this runs counter to the idea that, there's a unitary economy where all activity is or should be organized to one logic, right? Or to like one particular form of organizing. So this is why I think I like the idea of ecologies, and I used it there. And this is why I say plannings, as maybe also sound a little bit awkward, but plannings, ecologies in the plural, right? To kind of register that.
Right. And I mean, I immediately had to think of Rodrigo Nunes's work in his book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, where he very much thinks about these questions with regard to organization. And he
Mm,
speaks of organizational ecologies as well. Maybe picking up on what you said in your answer just right now. I mean, within the planning debate, at least, there is, I would say, even a more or less a consensus that one would need to have these ecologies of planning,
Yeah.
as you described them right now, in terms of semi-autonomous layers of democratic planning that act within societies, as I said, in a semi-autonomous manner, but that there nonetheless needs to be a form of coordination going on that is not just decentralized and distributed, but that one would need both. And this is also captured in the title of Nunes's work, neither vertical nor horizontal. You need both. And maybe I would be interested in your thinking with regard to this necessity of also having a form of overarching coordination, let's call it, with regard to this notion of planning's ecologies.
Yeah. So, it's funny how, papers, take on their final form. Actually, in earlier versions of this paper, I actually wrote, there was more writing on Nunes in particular, and I did uh, find his work very helpful. If I have to kind of, it's been a while since I read the book, I really like that book. There's this idea, I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, but this idea of compossibility, right? How do you make different organizational forms compossible, right? Resistances between different organizational forms are kind of inevitable. That is a feature of any kind of pluralist kind of organizational ecology, right? And I think, if I remember, he begins with this idea that, we should assume that any organizational ecology will have these plural social forms, right? So I would imagine, if we translate that, these more kind of ontological claims that I think, fair to characterize that way, that he's putting forward about the nature of kind of organized social life. If we translate that to the question of planning, well, perhaps planning can be thought of as trying to kind of regulate these resistances, these conflicts that are kind of inevitable in any kind of open and dynamic, society, right? And of course, especially if we're talking about, what planning might do in a kind of transitional phase, which is basically still a kind of class, society, right? There's a quote by Otto Neurath where he says, which also reminded me of Nunes in a way. Of course, a very different register, right? So, he says, within the framework of a deliberately devised economic plan, it is possible for forms of economy of various kinds to coexist without being forced into competition, right? So he lists and he says craft cooperatives, special settlements with shared work, industrial associations, right? Um, and so I could imagine, using kind of Nunes's language, like the problem here would be to make these different social forms compossible, right? Again, if I'm not misrepresenting, hopefully it's a creative misunderstanding. If it's a misunderstanding, um, misinterpretation, yeah. But yeah, definitely, I think his work is really great and could be used to think about planning in this way.
Absolutely. And I definitely like this take. I will record an episode with him soon, so I can ask him.
Yes, nice.
And we will find
Yes,
out.
looking forward to that.
So you also engage with Friedrich Hayek's argument against centralized planning and rightly state that there indeed can be forms of, let's say, distributed forms of planning. We just mentioned those as well, that have both central as well as decentral elements to it, and that can actually address some of the problems that Hayek did point out with regard to centralized planning. Now, I would like to maybe pick out one of these elements that Hayek critiqued, and you just mentioned a dynamic form of planning, for example. This is, of course, a standard critique of centralized forms of planning, that they are static and not really able to bring about this dynamism. And I would like to pick up on the maybe related aspect of discovery. Yevgeny Morozov very much highlighted this aspect in his 2019 paper on digital socialism, as well as in the conversation that I had with him in Future Histories, which I quite enjoyed. Niels Rochowitz, shout out to Niels. He wrote a fantastic paper on this topic as well, which I will link to in the show notes. And you do not really engage with this question of discovery specifically in your work. At least I didn't find it in these two papers. But you do engage with Hayek's critique quite a bit. But I would be interested in your take on the whole question of discovery within democratic planning. Or maybe framed differently, not really discovery within democratic planning, but democratic planning as discovery.
Yeah. It's a difficult one, because even, if we don't take the idea of discovery, for granted, like, for Hayek, it has a lot to do with his kind of theory of knowledge, right? That knowledge is disclosed kind of through practice in one way or another. But it's quite limited to the extent that for Hayek, this knowledge can only be disclosed through the market, right? And through market price. Yeah. The issue is, this obscures the fact that, there are other forms of knowledge throughout society, right? Which are embodied and tacit, that actually the market itself cannot kind of discover and disseminate. Yeah. And the question is then, what would alternative discovery procedures look like, if it's not through market price? I mean, one answer to that, which is, I think, part of the answer, but is quite limited, is, that you could develop this process of discovery through kind of discursive institutions, right? So we find that, like, in the idea of kind of negotiated coordination and so on, like, which I'm, very sympathetic to, right? There's a reliance on, deliberation, right? Of course, we want that. We need deliberation. We need, these spaces of assembly, and yeah, it doesn't make sense to talk about democracy if we don't have that. So, the question is, if we go back to what we said, regarding the economy is not this kind of unitary zone. It's internally differentiated, right? There are all kinds of different things going on in the economy. You have, state institutions, you have kind of, I mean, even within, let's say, the idea of negotiated coordination, you still have market exchange, right? And commons and households in the more, in the usual sense that, we use it. And, all these spaces, I would imagine, I mean, it's probably not a very satisfying answer, but all these spaces already have, specific forms of knowledge, specific forms of, discovering that kind of knowledge, and disseminating this knowledge in a number of different ways that, doesn't go through the market and cannot go through the market, right? So that's why I think it's difficult to give a single answer because of this diversity. But I think, beginning by recognizing that, is one step in that direction. I think it's something that, and we will get to this, with the Barcelona paper, for example. This is something that we should research kind of empirically and historically, to learn more about, to understand better. Yeah, I think that's what I could say, till now.
And you write that one of your aims with this article is to expand the archive of social imaginaries as part of broader efforts to envision and develop more desirable organizational futures, which I really liked as a framing of the task, I have to say. And I can totally relate to this project, because Future Histories is indeed quite invested in expanding the archive of social imaginaries as well, I would say. And I think there's not only this aspect of expanding our idea of the future to it, but as you also highlight in your text, quoting Jason Moore in this case, there's also this aspect of ideas as material forces. And planning, in order to function, will have to quite heavily rely on a, and I quote your text here, shared sense of meaning, coherence, and orientation. And this is something I think is super important for democratic planning to actually be able to work. And I think this layer of, let's call it a shared social imaginary, so to speak, as a form of collective directionality also is, at least in my opinion, probably more important than approaches that strictly look at the numbers and pretend as if it was a calculation problem, which was historically the framing that we stuck to on the left. And I would argue that it's much more a question of social imaginaries and collective, also imaginary forces, let's say, or a social imaginary as a force, than it is about like calculating the optimum of an of an equation, so to speak. So I would be interested. Could you maybe expand on this role of social imaginaries within democratic planning, and maybe not really just democratic planning, but basically the planetary oikos, to pick up on your language?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, planning, if we think of it, as we normally talk about it, and I affirm this view of it, is, planning is an attempt to use institutions kind of for the materialization of kind of not yet realized futures, right?
Mm.
In one way or another. It's future oriented in that way, right? Like, I mean, in the very definition, planning is ex ante, and so on and so forth, right? So there's this aspect of kind of the materialization of not yet realized futures that I think is kind of important for me. Um, Now, of course, that means it's planning is not kind of merely, as you said, this kind of technocratic or managerial practice. In the process of planning, planning presumes and produces these kind of normative imaginaries, right? Or frameworks, if you like, of action. Yeah. Um, and this gets to kind of what you were saying in terms of this kind of shared sense of meaning, coherence, and orientation, right? Um, what has been kind of, I think maybe, at the time when I was writing this, I was thinking of Frederick Jameson's idea of
Ah.
of cognitive mapping. Yeah. And so this is from his book, the Postmodernism book, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, 1991, I think. Um, and there he borrows from this urban theorist Kevin Lynch, right? So Kevin Lynch, um, he argues that he engages in the study of the experience of people kind of in different cities, of how they experience their city. Um, and he finds that the more alienating a city is, or one of the things that makes particular cities more alienating than others, is this incapacity to map
Ah.
the city, to like make it navigable, right? The sense of being lost, of not knowing where you are, right? And so Jameson takes this from Lynch, this kind of spatial perspective on the difficulty to navigate a city, and kind of thinks about how might we think of cognitive mapping in that sense, in relation to the social totality, right? And so he says, the incapacity to map socially is kind of as crippling as kind of the political experience of not being able to map spatially the places that we live in, right? And so what this demands is a kind of aesthetic of cognitive mapping, right? Which is this kind of impossible practice, right? This impossible practice of making the social totality, which is unknowable, somewhat knowable, right? Um, and he sees this as kind of an integral part of any kind of socialist project, right? Um, I was thinking of that, and I was thinking, planning can in part play such a role, right? If the capitalist market, if capitalist society is alienating and is grounded on kind of the atomization of social life, the fragmentation of our experience of everyday of the social totality. Um, Perhaps mapping can kind of counter this and make the social totality render it kind of navigable and somewhat
Mm.
intelligible, right? Uh, and Alberto Toscano and Jeff Kinkle actually kind of make some comments in this direction in their book, Cartographies of the Absolute. And there I found a reference to a paper from 1961, a New Left Review paper written by Perry Anderson, where he more or less makes a similar claim. Like he's writing in the context or in about kind of the context of
Mm.
Swedish social democracy in the 60s, and saying kind of the plan can be an instrument for rendering a community and its values visible to itself, right? Um, yeah, and I mean in the paper I also quote Mandel. There's a 1986 paper on planning, where he says, planning like markets have specific internal rationalities with effects on kind of the subjectivities, motivations, and values of those involved, right? So yes, I do think that, planning is also perhaps a kind of tool for, of producing social imaginaries, right? It has kind of that sense. And perhaps, even in the technocratic, the more technical sense of planning, perhaps that can't work without this aspect of the imaginary or the imaginal, right? Yeah, so I agree. I agree with your emphasis on the importance of this aspect of social imaginaries to thinking
Mm.
about planning.
Wow, I really like this take. I have to say, I absolutely have to read up on on this mapping framework because this is really a very helpful way of thinking about this. I have to say, and we are in dire need of some kind of mapping in that sense. I would say.
Hmm.
Perfect. Great.
I agree.
Yusuf, let's maybe transition to the second part of our conversation and the second paper that we wanted to talk about because
Hmm.
I think it's really super helpful because it brings down these very abstract things that we're talking about so far. It brings them down into a framework, into a perspective that is very much concerned with question of transformation. Let's say very concrete politics of transformation in the here and now. And the way in which you approach is a framing around metabolic municipalism, in which you engage with a very concrete case study in the wider Barcelona region. And the paper is titled Planning in Nature's Metropolis, Metabolic Municipalism and Ecological Planning in Barcelona. It's co-authored with Matt Thompson. Shout out to Matt here. And
Hmm.
as a start, could
Yeah.
you maybe give us an overview of the case study and what you mean by metabolic municipalism? And then we dive into different aspects of it going from there.
Sounds good. Yeah. So kind of in the work that I've done with Matt, we understand kind of radical municipalism as the contemporary revival in kind of social movement strategies for
Mm.
building dual power, right? At the municipal scale, right? So that's not to say that all kind of instances of municipalism have that kind of ambition or orientation, but this is kind of our understanding of kind of the potential of a kind of radical municipalism. This means kind of attempting to kind of reconfigure the social forms of capital in the state, as kind of complicated as such a process would be, while building forms of counterpower alongside, such a process, right? So municipalism, is limited in many ways. I think many of the critiques are valid, right? We It's not something it's something we're very kind of aware of. But we find it useful, nevertheless, kind of to think about how the municipal scale can potentially be an entry point for counter-hegemonic and democratic transformations, right? And obviously, yeah, we place a strong emphasis on kind of ecological interventions in urban metabolism, right? The idea is, how can we, there are all there are these alternatives experiments to develop alternatives taking place within the horizon of, what we recognize as municipalism. So there must be some lessons there for kind of thinking what some important elements of planning might look like, right? One of the problems, is, municipalism can easily be confused with kind of a fetishization of the local, right?
Mm.
And the mistaken view that localities are inherently more democratic and sustainable, right? So this is not,
Mm.
we don't take that view, and we try to kind of problematize that and account for that in our kind of proposals, or our interest, let's say, in municipalism. So yeah, so this is kind of precisely one of the things we're trying to kind of bring attention to take issue with, this kind of fetishization of the local, um, kind of methodological cityism, if you like, right? Through our engagement with theories of extended and planetary urbanization, right? So there's this Barcelona paper that, this ideas of extended urbanization are quite, inform our analysis there and the work we've done there. But then there's the competition and change paper, post-capitalist planning and urban revolution, where we kind of lay that out a bit more kind of conceptually. Um, so maybe I should say something about extended urbanization. Um, so we know that urbanization generates the concentration of people, right? Of means of production, of products, of information, right? And so on and so forth, right? So what we get with urbanization is the production of increasingly dense, agglomerations, right? Of concentrated urbanism. What is normally overlooked, so municipalism tends to be understood and tends to intervene at this level, if you like. What can we do in these kind of spaces of concentrated urbanization, right? Barcelona is definitely one example of that. More recently with the election of Mamdani as mayor of New York City, right? You think of places like New York as kind of spaces of concentrated urbanization, right? What is sometimes overlooked, right, was maybe often overlooked, and not understood as part of kind of the process of urbanization itself, is that it also results kind of in the expansion, in the explosion of an urban fabric, right, that
Mm.
produces extended urbanization, right? So like food, water, and other materials need to be produced kind of beyond the city and brought into cities, yeah, into spaces of concentrated urbanization. And this, of course, relies on this kind of complex infrastructure that is of an increasingly planetary scale that we talked a bit about already, right? Logistical systems and supply chains are one, example of these infrastructures. You know, we need kind of supply chains to get food to cities, right? Food that is, if not produced in kind of the hinterlands of major cities, in places very far, far away from where we live, right? That is kind of what the idea of extended urbanization allows us kind of to think about, right? So, like I said, municipalism in general tends to have little to say about this.
Mm.
But in Barcelona, I found that there was a discussion and an interest and a commitment, led kind of in large part by this kind of strategic planning office for the metropolitan region and other important actors involved, in kind of intervening in these kind of more stretched out metabolic relations, right? And that was kind of that I thought I need to kind of study this. It is a planning office. There are people in this office who see themselves as planners. There this is something important to think about, and to kind of do some research on. So yes, there was kind of an interest and commitment in thinking these, interventions in these kind of more stretched out kind of metabolic relations, and particularly kind of around agriculture and food, right? So it is a strange term, this idea of metabolic municipalism. I thought about it a little bit. Okay, you have to go ahead with something. But I think, it does capture what we're trying to get at, right? Which is this kind of the non-city fabric of extended urbanization, right? And what a planning that is municipal, that is nevertheless municipal, how I might engage with this fabric, right? Um, with this extended fabric of urbanization. So that's a bit about, that paper, what's behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I mean, what would you say? Because maybe first off, I really like the framing of metabolic municipalism because it's very catchy. And actually, at least for me, it's quite immediately clear what you're
Mm,
trying to point
nice. Okay,
towards.
good to hear that.
Yeah. But what would you say are the most important levers that have been used in the Barcelona case? Because, as you said, they try to at least somewhat internalize a notion of extended urbanization into their efforts of planning for a metabolic municipalism. What were the most important levers that they tried to use in order to do that?
hmm Yeah. I mean, so this process is severely constrained. I mean, because of kind of the history of marketization and how that has impacted things, even, like city governance and, metropolitan institutions, right? So whereas in the past or once upon a time, an institution like a Metropolitan Planning Office would have significantly more power in planning capacities, this is not, really the case in Barcelona, right? As I think in other places. If we begin by thinking of there's that paper by Cédric Durand, Elena Hofferbeth, and Matthias Schmelzer, I think, if I said the name correctly,
Yes, that's
where
right.
they make a distinction between elaborative functions and executive functions, right? So elaborative functions are kind of the process, all the things that go into actually developing plans, right? And the executive functions are how kind of those plans are implemented. And what you find in the case of Barcelona is that essentially it is an elaborative planning institution, right? And severely constrained in terms of its executive functions. So then, the question is, how do you work around this problem, right? You have people who find themselves in the planning office really wanting to make a change, right? Not wanting to kind of develop plans that just sit there as kind of documents, but to actually implement these kind of visions that they have for the future of the kind of metropolitan region. Um, and so uh, what they did was identify existing institutions. Uh, in most cases, these were public sector institutions or agencies that have some kind of relationship with kind of the particular issue or sector, if you like, that they're engaging with, right? So in the case of agriculture and food, there was a food charter that was written a couple of years ago, and a office for I'm translating from Spanish. You can say an office for sustainable food for the metropolitan region, right? So this is a public agency. It has certain executive capacities and resources that the planning office doesn't have, right? Um, so in this case, kind of they made use of that institution to bring together kind of the relevant actors in agriculture and food in the metropolitan region in a more or less, coordinated way to develop kind of different projects that would be in line with certain objectives that were set at a kind of higher scale, right? So if you think of, if we just focus on the question of food, there is this goal that was set to so that I think it was 60% of the food that is consumed in the region should be kind of produced in the region, right? And this was a goal set by 2030, right? And so there are several different projects, some already in existence, some new, that there was attempt to kind of bring, to organize some coherence between them in kind of the pursuit of that, 2030 target. Yeah. So there were kind of three things that they focused on, right? In the short term, right? There are many projects that they're trying to kind of get off the ground and scale. But right now, at least when I was kind of studying this kind of experiment in what we might call metabolic municipalist planning, there were kind of three areas of focus, right? So number one was Barcelona has already kind of a long history of peri-urban agricultural parks, right? So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are about six, at least six in the metropolitan region. right? And so there was a focus on kind of protecting those spaces from urban sprawl, from other kinds of, infrastructural developments that might harm these spaces, right? So protecting them, but also kind of expanding them, right? These spaces included, in many cases, like in one particular agricultural park that I visited, many of these were kind of family-owned farms or kind of small-holding, farms. Some of them kind of cooperatively owned. Many of them kind of more or less kind of aligned with agroecological principles, right? Um, and so in addition to kind of protecting these spaces, right, there was a project which is what kind of I focus on in this paper, to develop a kind of counter logistics of food, right? So this is kind of an alternative supply chain of, we can say, kind of uh, agroecologically produced food that is produced and consumed kind of in the metropolitan region, right? The economic kind of rationale for this is to kind of make the lives and livelihoods of farmers in the region, you know, kind of more dignified and to make their lives easier, essentially, to make better incomes, right? Um, but also for consumers as individuals, but also public institutions, for it to be more affordable to actually buy this kind of regional produce, right? It's much easier, it's much cheaper to go to like a big supermarket, right? For example. So there was an attempt to kind of make it more affordable for people, for everyday consumers, but also public institutions to buy this locally, regionally produced food, right? So there's that kind of economic rationale for it. Um, and kind of just to kind of final point, an important element of this is, public procurement, right? Of this food, right? So we're not just talking about individual consumption behaviors, but kind of the consumption at the level of kind of public institutions, but also kind of the development of municipal markets, right? So you have this kind of network of, this kind of three things that are emphasized: public procurement, the protection and expansion of agricultural parks along kind of more or less sustainable principles, and the development of this counter logistics of food, right? So there are many actors involved, right? Social solidarity economy actors, public institutions, primarily, uh, but the planning office kind of played an important role in this, right? So the planning office was able to bring all these actors together. And it did function as a kind of incubator, right? This is kind of like startup speak, right? As
Mhm.
an incubator for this, if you want, like public commons, public community, if you like, startup, right? Which at the moment is quite, um, small scale and is still an experiment, right? But it's not, unimaginable, for this to be scaled with the right resources and, commitment and so on and so forth. So that's kind of a little bit about the project. Yeah. The levers, I think you're asking me about what are kind of the levers, right? So I hope I kind of answered that, question in one way or another.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You did answer that in different layers. I mean, you gave some levers who they tried to find despite being constrained as an in their executive function, so to speak. So I think I would be interested in two elements. I mean, the first would be the way in which the local level is being constrained is actually going quite deep in some cases. I mean, up to EU-wide laws that prohibit the way in which you choose the people who can take up an offer of the public sector to provide a service and stuff like that. So there is a like deep structural problem with regard to how self-define the form of government can be even on the municipal level.
Yeah.
And I would be interested in what your thoughts are with regard to not only circumventing that, but overcoming it and thereby coming into a position where you actually gain this power over the executive function as well, and not only through these workarounds, but in very practical terms, at least on the municipal level. I think that would be the first part. And then the second one is much quicker. It's how did these projects go on after Barcelona and Comú losing power?
Mhm.
Because the case study they did was very much, I think, linked and closely attached to this form of radical municipalism that Barcelona was able to bring about in these 8 years of being in power. But now, as they lost power, is this still going on? Are they still pushing towards these types of municipal metabolism and forms of planning for such a municipal metabolism?
Yeah. So if I understood the first question, the first part of the question, yes. So if you even if you just take these three things that we're focused on in the kind of planning for food sustainability, if you like, that this project that the planning office is taking part in, um, each of those three developments have been quite, if you just consider those three developments have been faster for some rather than others, right? So if you take the question of public procurement, this is much more complicated, right? Because first you're talking about certain kind of policies that need to change, not at the level of Barcelona as a city or as a kind of metropolitan region. There is no kind of administrative body at the metropolitan scale, but at the level of kind of the Catalan national government, right? So
Mm,
already that's quite slow, and it involves a very different kind of engagement with the state and different kinds of struggle and so on, and different kinds of expertise, right? Um, so yes, I mean you see that kind of unevenness if you look at kind of all the different things that the planning office is doing, you can see that unevenness, right? Uh, in the case of kind of the developing this counter logistics of food, this alternative
mm,
supply chain, that was easier, right? Because you already
mm,
have these agroecological farms in place. It's very much kind of in their interest to be able to sell their produce through these alternative routes, right? You have a kind of agricultural union, which was at the center of kind of governing this process, right? So you
mm.
have many of these institutions already in place that um, could begin to do, some work, right? So, even intervention at the municipal scale, like you suggest, will have to kind of go beyond the municipal, right? To realize these kind of more place-based alternatives, right? So I think that, that's definitely, the case. Um, a similar kind of in the question of things like water sovereignty struggles in Barcelona. There's this long ongoing battle with Akbar, which is a private company that has been managing water provisioning in Barcelona. And they have a contract, if I remember. I mean, it's like there's at least, I don't know, at least 2 decades left on their contract and to manage the water. And so that's like a protracted kind of struggle, right? And I don't think can be solved purely at the kind of municipal level and involves all these other kinds of institutions, right? So there is that kind of unevenness that I think is important to account for. I don't know if I answered your first question before I move on to the second one.
I think it it remains to be an open question in general. I think in how we can gain power over that which is right now situated at, I don't know, the EU level or international corporations and stuff like that. So I mean, basically, as I understood it, it's going to be a fight, and it's going to be a struggle. And I mean, I'm not sure if there's much more to. I mean, we can of course think about how to effectively coordinate these things or how to find workarounds as you just described them. So, I guess
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, yes, all these things would require forms of organizing that go beyond the municipal scale. But nevertheless, many of these problems are being experienced, and many of these struggles are taking place at kind of where people live,
Yeah.
right? So there are these different layers, I think, that we need to find a way to bring together to make these changes, to kind of implement these changes. Um, then there is a second question.
They are not in power anymore. How? Yeah.
Um, So my research stopped. I mean, I stopped this. I think I will, continue to study what's going on in Barcelona, but at least, the research that went into writing this paper stopped in 2024,
Mm.
right? So that was kind of a year into the new government in Barcelona, which is the PSOE, the Socialist Party of Catalonia. Um, um, what was happening at that time is, again, because I was focusing on questions of food, there was already this kind of institutional fabric outside the state that was able to kind of keep some momentum, for these projects, right? Uh, m- Based on kind of my ongoing communication or sense of what's going on there, these projects are continuing, and there's still a discussion of kind of thinking about, the kind of urban agrarian relations, right? The urban rural relations that structure kind of the metropolitan region of Barcelona. Um, the people that were in charge of the planning office, so the general coordinator, the executive president of the planning office, they were put in place under, when Ada Colau came into government, and they are still in place,
Ah.
right? So there is that kind of continuity kind of within the planning office. I think my guess is that, what you will find is not different from what was happening even in the time where, Barcelona and Camus was in government, right? That depending on the issue that you're talking about, um, progress, development, kind of momentum of different projects is going to be uneven, right?
Mm.
Uh, so if you take something like the issue with Barcelona's airport, right? There was a proposition put forward to kind of expand the airport, and the expansion of the airport would compromise directly kind of agricultural zones of the metropolitan region, right? So there was kind of very kind of clear opposition to this when Ada Colau was in government.
Mm.
But the planning office was very quiet about this. And I think this has to do with the fact that, they see themselves as kind of playing this kind of facilitating role. And it becomes difficult for them to do their job without antagonizing different kind of interests in the region. There's different perspectives, as far as I know, from within the planning office of how this should be done, right? So I know some people say like, no, we need to politicize the planning process, right? It's not this kind of managerial kind of just process of balancing different interests, right? Of negotiation. Um, but I don't think everyone necessarily shares that view, right? So that's also just an aspect of kind of the institutional reality of this planning office, kind of, accounting for all the contradictions of trying to have this more progressive, if you like, form of planning in a capitalist society. Um, so yes, after Barcelona and Camus, I think it's not necessarily, probably not so different from the reality um, of when they were in government, which is that progress will be quite uneven, right? But yes, there is this continuity in terms of kind of the leadership of the organization, and there is still a discussion about these questions that I've been talking about, like this idea of this incipient kind of metabolic municipalism. I think the thing to take from that is, this kind of fairly obvious point, I think, that, economic planning is, like we've said, is not this kind of technocratic thing, right? It depends on the kind of, if you like, value regimes or political regimes that it's kind of embedded in, right? And so the successive planning is kind of highly dependent on all these other kind of institutional preconditions, right? So we can have kind of these discussions, very important discussions about, uh, calculation, how do we account for the diversity of values in a way that is not mediated through market price, you know, more or less kind of utopian speculation of, all these different models of planning. But the fact is that, whatever we form of planning we end up with, it's going to be kind of through a process of struggle, right? Um, and so these kind of political institutional conditions within which, we experiment and develop forms of planning is kind of fundamental, right? And there'll be some steps forward and then some steps back, I guess. And, that's just part of political life, I guess.
Absolutely, it is. And it will stay that way, I
Yes.
guess. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's totally fine as well.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the last question that I ask all of my guests, I would like to maybe point out two, let's call it claims or maybe observations that
Hmm.
you made with regard to this specific case study in Barcelona. And I think they very much relate to a lot of the topics that we touched upon within our conversation today. And the first one would be that you say that they try to conceptualize questions of democratic planning, of municipal metabolism beyond a notion of the economy defined as a kind of closed space. They try to redefine what we understand when we talk of the economy with regard to democratic planning. That would be one thing that I find to be very interesting, that this is a very concrete instantiation of how to enact this kind of perspective in very concrete terms on the municipal level. And the other one would be, and you already touched upon the counter logistical element of it, which I also like as a framing, I have to say. The other one would be that you see a form of distributed planning being enacted through this type of municipal metabolism and the way that they approached it. Both of these things are quite crucial, I think, with regard to questions of democratic planning on an abstract level, and then you go and find them on the ground in your empirical work in Barcelona in this case study, which I found to be a really fruitful and very important bringing together of theory and praxis. Maybe you could speak on these two elements, redefining quote unquote the economy, or the economic, maybe better. And then as a second part of it, this notion of a form of distributed planning, I might add, call it a distributed planning without power, which is also an interesting note to it.
Yeah. Right. So, like I said, the context that I was studying was, what are the kind of changes that were taking place within the planning office, right, in terms of how they understood planning and how they tried to rethink planning practice as such, right? And the context is, of course, like I said, the broader context of municipalism in Barcelona, which is kind of really marked by a kind of ecofeminist, eco-socialist politics, right? Again, centering questions of social reproduction, centering questions of, ecology, right? Much more social reproduction, but, also ecology. Yeah. Um, so that's kind of the context that they were in. And what, how this is expressed in terms of, what changes within, the planning office. You go from a planning office that was kind of very much in line with kind of neoliberal conceptions of economic development, like the attraction of foreign investment, the development of like, uh, tech-oriented smart cities, startup culture and all this, right? Which for certain kind of audiences seems quite sexy, right? Um, and there's a kind of a strong shift away from that to saying, what we need is to secure, you know, the conditions for a safe, secure, desirable, dignified existence to make the city, like the region, the metropolitan region, uh, um, a place where, people can, live comfortably and, so on and so forth, right? What does that mean? That means obviously emphasizing those aspects of economic life that are, um, normally invisibilized or marginalized as unimportant for, economic development. Yeah. So, things like food, right? Like what we've talked about. public housing or more accessible housing, water, and so on and so forth. I think that is kind of what I was trying to get at in saying, this is a case where you see an attempt to kind of redefine the economic and economic planning, right? To kind of recenter those aspects of economic life that are normally marginalized, like I said, but also forms of organizing that are not normally seen as important to development, like in organizations in the social solidarity economy and also the public sector, right? So I think that was a quite clear shift that you saw within the planning office in the context of municipalism. What is the future of that? I'm not sure. Let's see. I
Mm.
hope it continues. Um, Now, the issue of kind of the question of distributed planning, right, or planning without power, is, as a kind of researcher, I found myself kind of in the beginning quite frustrated with the case. Like, they have these plans, but it's very difficult for them to kind of do anything, right? Like I mentioned that distinction between kind of the elaborative functions and the executive functions. And so I immediately thought, well, they see themselves, they articulate it in this way as kind of wanting to work towards a form of distributed planning, right? Okay, that might be desirable, but they also don't really have a choice, right? It's not like they can actually have a kind of centralized command planning, right? So the fact is that, this is in one way or another an outcome of not having power. Right. And so that's why I put, I think it's an open question. Distributed planning or planning without power, right? And so there are ways that they try to work around that, which we talked about. So kind of developing this kind of distributed layer and architecture of planning, which includes organizations that are already in existence, right? Already doing things, right? Like not trying to kind of reinvent the wheel where it's not necessary, but also kind of identifying, what new things might be done and kind of facilitating that process and bringing in institutions that do have some power, right? Some resources. Yeah. Um, One thing to say is, I started off with thinking this was a kind of deficiency, and I ended with the view that, maybe that's not so much a problem. Perhaps, again, there are all these debates about like centralization, decentralization, command planning, or directive planning and indicative planning, right? And perhaps, at a municipal scale, if you're engaging with kind of social solidarity, kind of economy institutions, maybe that is, again, it's an open question for me. Maybe that is a more desirable form of organizing planning that kind of respects the autonomy of these more smaller scale alternatives, right? Um, that would be quite different, if we're talking about like a large public sector organization, right? Um, so that's kind of what I was trying to make sense of with that, I guess, question or way to put it, with distributed planning or planning without power, right? Yeah.
That's absolutely hilarious because I definitely did not get this double meaning.
Okay.
I really just read it as a desirable form of non-dominating
Okay.
planning.
Yeah.
I just read it as, oh, cool.
Hmm.
There's a way of like coordinating on a meta level different actors who can have a semi autonomous say in how they enact their specific local practices, while also providing this meta coordination on a technically higher level of organization. And I was just like, oh, wow, nice. Look at this distributed planning that does not need to rely on power. And it absolutely escaped me that you simultaneously also meant that, well, they did not have the executive function. They did not have the power over that, and therefore had to rely on distributed planning
Yeah.
without power.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's really funny.
Yeah. So
I absolutely
yeah, so
didn't get
I
it.
think
Yeah.
I ended kind of where you with what your reading was. That's sort of
Yeah,
where I
right,
ended, like,
right.
well, maybe this is okay, right? At this scale. It also reminds me there was a document that came out, I think in 2017, by what was then called the Union Populaire, like I guess that was the name, Popular Unity, which is kind of the previous version of the, what is it called in French? Nouveau Front Populaire, the new Popular Front, like led by Mélenchon and the, or
Mm. Oh
Mélenchon.
yeah. In 2022 they had this
So there was a
this document, right?
This was I think it was maybe 2022. No, I don't. It's a few years ago. If maybe 2022. And in that document, they do kind of distinguish, between kind of different kinds of organizations, right? And they say something like, well, with public sector organizations, you need a kind of, binding form of planning, where kind of
Yeah.
the elaborative plans are binding in that sense, are executed upon in this way.
Yeah.
And there are obviously many other examples we can think of, right? Like there's it's not our discussion today, but there's work I've been doing. There's a paper that came out recently on kind of planning for kind of oil and gas companies, and of course there you could think of a kind of more binding form of planning, right? But in that same document that I was referring to, when it comes to kind of regional institutions or kind of at lower scales, if you like, they say something like, if I remember correctly, something like green indicative planning, or that's
Right.
the term that they use.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that has a different kind of power relation, right?
Right.
When it comes to kind of the question of executing the plan, right?
Right.
So that's, yeah, maybe distributed planning without power is okay in at that level, and something
Right.
desirable. Right? Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. So let's see whether or not there will be planning without power or planning with power on the municipal level and beyond. But I'm absolutely sure about the fact that we will need some form of metabolic municipalism in order to make democratic planning work and create a form of planetary oikos that is desirable on all levels of collective self-government, let's say. Yousaf, before we part, there's one question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Hmm. Wow, this is there's not much to place our hopes on these days, it seems, right? I mean, I'm gonna answer the question as honestly as possible, and it's as a parent, what gives me joy are my kids, right? But kind of to move beyond the kind of the personal, in that sense. There's a quote from Mike Davis. I think it's from Planet of Slums. I think it's from there. And he says, at the end of the day, the best measure of the humanity of any society is the life and happiness of its children. We live in a rich society with poor children, and that should be intolerable, right? So what gives me hope are kind of struggles that, try to move towards a society where that's no longer the reality, right? I think that's why I place an emphasis on questions of social reproduction, on questions of, the biosphere, the very conditions of our kind of existence on Earth, right? And so struggles in that direction, I think are, what give me hope. Yeah.
Wonderful, Yousaf. Thank you so much for taking part in Future Histories.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.